the very principle of constitutionally limited government is in peril as a result of an epidemic of make-believe judging, of judges who basically start out in many, if not most, constitutional cases with the end point already in mind, which is that the government will be permitted to do whatever it's trying to do, and then simply reverse engineer a decision from there and rationalize some way in which the Constitution authorizes the government to do whatever it's doing. And I'd like to give you a few examples of that by way of sort of launching into the talk. The Constitution limits government in two particularly important ways. The federal government is limited, or at least was supposed to be limited, by the doctrine of enumerated powers. The idea was that if we only give some powers to the federal government, then we don't really have to worry too much about which rights we reserve, because the federal government can't do more than we've authorized it to do. The image I use in the book is, if you put yourself inside of a shark cage, then you only have a few inches to move around, but if you put the shark in the cage, the rest of the ocean is yours. And that's the vision, that's the idea of government that the framers had for how to restrict the federal government. The other important limitation, and there are many, but the other really major important limitation on government power in the Constitution is the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868 after a disastrous national experiment with what sometimes people call states' rights, or the idea that there are no significant constitutional restraints on the power of state governments. I'm sure I don't have to enumerate for this crowd all of the many ways in which this was a disaster, starting with slavery, censorship of abolitionist speech. The list goes on and on and on. And that's why we have a 14th Amendment, to correct the disastrous belief that unfortunately the founders had and that persisted for more than 100 years, that basically we could trust the states not to violate individual rights, and it was not necessary for there to be any constitutional, or at least no federal constitutional restrictions on the states. So the examples that I'm going to give will deal with both of these issues. Now, I'm sure all of you will remember June 28th, 2012, a day which shall live in constitutional infamy. That is, of course, the day on which the Supreme Court handed down the Obamacare decision and said that essentially nationalizing about 1/6 of the economy was perfectly consistent with the doctrine of enumerated federal powers that I described a moment ago. Some people saw in the NFIB v. Sebelius opinion, aka Obamacare, a silver lining, because, as you may recall, the federal government was not allowed to micromanage our healthcare decisions on the basis of its usual go-to power, the Commerce Clause. 5 justices said that was, even for them, that was too much of a stretch. And so Chief Justice Roberts essentially rewrote portions of the Affordable Care Act to transform the individual mandate to purchase insurance into an option that you could exercise or not as you see fit, and you would just pay slightly more in taxes if you chose not to exercise this totally voluntary option. Now, never mind the fact that the law actually refers to the individual mandate as a penalty some 18 times, and even the Chief Justice acknowledged that it was more naturally read as a mandate than an option. When you're dealing with make-believe judging, the question is not what is the correct constitutional result. The question is, can I rationalize my way backwards from a bend over backwards and let the government do what it wants in this case? And let me just say, if you put enough creative people in a room together from all 3 branches, they will usually come up with a way to rationalize whatever the government is doing, and hence the epidemic of runaway government and make-believe judging in this country. Now, we were all assured, right, that one of the great things, or one of the things we should be happy about with the NFIB decision, was that the Supreme Court had tightened up Commerce Clause jurisprudence. Well, let me tell you a little story about the message that at least one federal circuit court got in the wake of that. This is 6 months after the Obamacare decision came down, December of 2012. The 11th Circuit handed down a decision in which they discuss the Obamacare decision, the supposedly tightened up federalism, and here's what was the issue in this case. There is a museum in Key West, Florida, called the Hemingway Home and Museum. It is actually the house where Hemingway did a lot of his writing. and it's now a museum, and it's a kind of a funky museum. It's in Key West, which is a very funky place, and so there's a lot of greenery outside, and things are pretty informal, and one of the things you'll notice if you go there, as my wife and I did back in February, is there's a bunch of cats running around. Well, these cats are the descendants of a six-toed cat that was supposedly given to Hemingway by a sea captain. The cat was called Snowball, and one of the interesting things about Snowball was that he had 6 toes. He was a polydactyl cat. So there's all these descendants of Snowball running around the museum. Well, somewhere along the way, a volunteer at the museum got disgruntled with the museum and decided that she wanted to get the museum in trouble. And the way she was going to do it was she was going to point out that in her view, the cats were not being properly taken care of because they had no shelter to sleep in at night. Now, who do you go to when you want to get the Hemingway Museum in Key West, Florida, in trouble for not taking care of its cats properly? You might think the local animal control board, possibly the county health department. No, be more ambitious. Put your mind to work. You go straight to the US Department of Agriculture if you're really serious about getting this museum in trouble, and that's precisely what this woman did. And the Department of Agriculture opened a 2-year investigation and sent a team of investigators down to Key West not once but 3 times to document what nobody disputed, which was that these were outdoor cats with no shelters to sleep at night, and ultimately sat down with the owners of the museum and began to dictate to them the changes that would be necessary in order for the museum to come into compliance with a federal law that was originally enacted to enable the federal government to take care of primates in science experiments and laboratories and things. But they had stretched it all the way to cats at the Hemingway Museum. Now, for those of you of a constitutional mindset, you might say to yourself, well, where does the federal government derive any constitutional authority to tell the Hemingway Home and Museum how to take care of its cats? Particularly cats that were not bought or sold, but were merely born, and not for nothing, are marooned at the very southern tip of Florida and will never cross a state line. Well, it's got to be the Commerce Clause, right? Because that's what it always is. So how do you get there? Well, you got to hand it to the 11th Circuit. Here's how they got there. There's a gift shop at the museum, and it sells cat-related merchandise. So that means these cats have a substantial effect on interstate commerce because people might be coming down from New York and Virginia to buy cat-related potholders and keychains. Well, this is fake judging. This is not a genuine attempt by any reasonable stretch of the imagination to enforce constitutional limits on government power, and I will say this, it is a mockery. It is a mockery of the principle of enumerated powers, particularly in the wake of a decision that we were all assured was going to, or had tightened up the Commerce Clause doctrine. Well, apparently the 11th Circuit at least didn't get the message. And by the way, you may recall, the 11th Circuit was the court that originally struck down the Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act on Commerce Clause grounds. So if anything, the message the 11th Circuit got apparently was to loosen up, and boy did they. Cats in the Hemingway Museum. Well, thank goodness that the framers' plan for limited government, the thing that is supposed to be our primary protection from a tyrannical federal government, is in the hands of a judiciary like that.